interest. The title is Musical Preference Correlates Closely to Professional Roles and Specialties in Operating Room. A multi-center cross-sectional cohort study with 672 participants. And not only does this have 672 participants, it has 10 authors. Now, this is evidently an international study. It's got, the first author just has a BA degree, believe it or not, in an Elsevier surgery journal from Harvard, a BA, and is part of Harvard Medical School, Boston, Massachusetts. The other 9 authors all have MDs, and a couple of them have PhDs on top of that. They're from also Harvard Medical School, the University of Tokyo Hospital in Tokyo, Japan, Department of Surgical Oncology at MD Anderson in Houston, Texas, one of the biggest cancer places in the US, and Massachusetts General Hospital at Harvard Medical School, and Brigham and Women's Hospital at Harvard Medical School. Background for this paper: it is unclear whether music preferences and perceptions in the operating room, OR, differ by demographic and professional factors, and how an improved understanding of these potential differences can be leveraged to enhance team dynamics in the OR work environment. Currently, there is limited knowledge regarding the impact of music on OR team concentration and communication. That's the background. Methods. This study was a multi-center cross-sectional study of 282 preoperative patients and 390 providers attending physicians, residents, and nurses in anesthesiology and surgery. Patient and provider responses were measured using a newly developed questionnaire. Results. These are the results, folks. Patients who highly enjoyed music felt music alleviated stress and enhanced concentration and communication, and favored use of music in the OR. The genres favored by most patients were rock music, 32%, classical music, 28%, and top 40 hits, 26%. All providers reported a high frequency of use of music during the operation. Nurses and residents were more likely than attendings to report high enjoyment of music in the OR. Surgeons and anesthesiologists had high median scores for enjoyment of music and low median scores for music as distraction. Anesthesiologists preferred classical and jazz blues at lower volumes, compared with surgeons who favored top 40 music at higher noise pressure levels. Patients and providers perceived music to improve provider concentration and team communication. Nurses held the most positive views. Conclusion: musical preference and perceptions of the effect of music in the OR differ by both professional status and specialty, and provide insight into broader team dynamics that could be leveraged potentially to optimize the OR environment. It is unclear whether music preferences and perceptions in the operating room differ by demographic and professional factors, and how an improved understanding of these potential differences can be leveraged to enhance team dynamics and the OR work environment. Too bad that's unclear, folks. Boy, I was hoping they'd have an answer. But currently there is limited knowledge regarding the impact of music on operating room team concentration and communication. So science marches on, friends. Rest assured.
Thank you, Al. I was glad there was no mention of rap or death metal in that study. That would seem inappropriate for the operating room there. Thank you. It is my pleasure to introduce a new speaker introducer today. He has big shoes to fill, taking over for Joyce Lackey. Joyce is in the woods today, but she's left plenty of breadcrumbs to get home safely. It's my pleasure to introduce Stephen Kroll.
When I asked Chris Huffine, our speaker today, to tell me a little bit about himself, the first thing he told me was that he was born in Chicago. And I paused, and he paused, and then he said, and I grew up in Hyde Park. He's a good Chicagoan. Anybody who tells you they're from Chicago will tell you their neighborhood. And Hyde Park is a particularly interesting neighborhood. Those of us who are follow the life of Barack and Michelle Obama know that they lived in Hyde Park prior to 2008. Hyde Park is the home of the University of Chicago. And so it's also an intellectual center in Chicago. And for me, I had a very personal attraction to Hyde Park. As a young boy in Chicago, I visited the Museum of Science and Industry in Jackson Park many times. And to do that, I traveled to Hyde Park from way in the Northwest side. So I was glad to have a fellow Chicagoan to introduce for the first time. Upon graduating from high school, Chris attended his undergraduate college at Carleton College in Northfield, Minnesota, a liberal arts college located about 40 miles south of the Twin Cities, and a very fine school. After graduating from Carleton, Chris attended the Virginia Consortium for Professional Psychology to earn a doctorate in psychology. And the particular program he attended was one to prepare a person for clinical practice and leadership roles in mental health. And surely you'll see that Chris, in fact, has done that. His first introduction to Portland came when he had an internship in Portland following the completion of his doctorate degree, and where he worked in Portland and, as he said, fell in love with the city. He took a job in 1992 at an organization called the Men's Resource Center, which was founded in Portland some 20 years before that, with a purpose to discuss men's problems from a pro-feminist perspective. The focus of the Men's Resource Center was on issues such as non-sexist parenting, sexism in schools, homophobia, rape prevention, and while he was there, he discovered the field of domestic violence, which was a growing field in the area, and one which you'll see is an area of particular interest to him. He remained at the Men's Resource Center for a period until about 2004, when he left to found an organization that ultimately led to the organization that he's now in charge of, an organization called Allies in Change. Allies in Change is a nonprofit social activist organization and counseling services center. They offer individual counseling, couples counseling, and group counseling for men and women struggling with a variety of issues, including relationship issues, rebuilding issues, including trust, anger, depression, working on issues including trust, anger, depression, stress, anxiety, significant life transitions, PTSD, and many other issues. Chris, in addition to his professional work, has a personal life in Portland, which included the raising of two young men to manhood. And as all of us do, he has participated in many of the wonderful attractions that are present in Portland. He's interested in fine dining, he watches movies, listens to ambient music, he travels, and he likes to go for walks, and don't we all? Chris tells us that his experience in Portland and the work that he's done has given him more than simply a job, but in fact, he's discovered that it's a calling and one which he expects to be practicing for the rest of his life. I can't imagine a better person to address us on the topic of his talk today, which is domestic violence during the pandemic. Chris?
Thank you very much. So I'm going to now share my PowerPoint presentation. Hopefully this will go okay. There we go. All right. So as at least some of you know, I've spoken before as recently as last fall to you all. And today what I'm going to do is will be a little bit repetitious, but my intent is to briefly talk about, provide an overview of domestic violence 101, very briefly to give you an idea of what we mean by domestic violence. And then to talk some about how it's intersecting with the current situation of COVID-19 around the world, and including why is it so much more serious now? Why has it increased so much? So you can better understand that. And a few ideas about what you can do. I wish I had more ideas about what you could do. That could also be a room for discussion. And so with that, I'll kind of move along. Very briefly, Allies in Change. It's an agency, as mentioned, that I started almost 16 years ago now. We're a 501c3 private nonprofit. On the surface, we do counseling for adults, individual and couples counseling. But really, the heart of the agency, and we have two locations. One is in Northeast Portland on 10th and Broadway, and then also in Beaverton, right near the intersection of 26 and 217. The heart of the agency is really our abuse intervention work that we do. We offer about 24 groups a week for people who are abusive. These are long-term groups. Typically, people are in them for upwards of a year or longer. And we work with people who are court involved, in part, people who have a criminal charge against them, or who are involved with child welfare or directed by family court to attend. But then we also work with people who are voluntarily coming in. And that last point down there is to be clear that people who are voluntarily engaging, money will not be a barrier to them getting services with us in terms of this deal with their abusive behavior. The group intake, we can drop it down as low as $10 for a 1-hour individual intake, and the group fee basically we can drop down as low as need be. We are able to provide our services purely based on the fees that we collect. So even though we're a nonprofit, we get a very small number of donations over the course of the year, and we don't get really any grants of any kind. So we have been hit pretty significantly by COVID because we've seen a significant drop in clients because we've not seen people in person. What we are doing is Zoom groups. So I'm very familiar with Zoom, and we've been doing Zoom groups for about 2 months now. And we're having about 2/3 attendance to those. So we're doing what we can to kind of keep going, and we will endure, but it's been challenging. A few other groups we do a group for survivors, female survivors, women who have been in abusive relationships, either presently are in an abusive relationship or have been in the past. We also in the fall started an LGBTQ multi-gender abuse intervention group for people who are being abusive, who do not identify as heterosexual. And then I do trainings and workshops such as this kind of thing. So that's kind of like, PBS, when you see a show, they kind of say who it's sponsored by. So that's a little background on the sponsoring agency, and I'll kind of jump into the stats both pre and post. So what we know is that in general, domestic violence is an issue for a lot of people. It's estimated that about 1 in 3 women in the United States and actually internationally will be physically assaulted at least once by a romantic partner sometime in their lifetime. Likewise, among those women who are murdered, about 1/3 of the women who are murdered by a current or former intimate partner. And stalking is a significant issue. Most of the women who get murdered or are nearly murdered, in other words, they could have died, were stalked. Something like 85 to 90% were stalked. So stalking is a particular concern, indicator of high risk. We know that when we talk about crime statistics and rates of domestic violence, it's been estimated that only about half of all physical assaults, domestic assaults that are physical, are reported to the police. Now, when we get into the fact that most domestic violence involves non-physical abuse, the number of reports to the police drops much, much lower, in part because most of that violence isn't even illegal. No law has been broken, so the police really can't do anything anyway. And I think that's a point I've made in the past, and I think I'll make again here in just a little bit as well. And then the gender issue is that when you look at who's really being battered, who is the victim of ongoing abusive behavior, what we find is that somewhere in the area of 85 to 90% of all the perpetrators of that kind of ongoing abusive behavior are male, identify as male, and likewise about 85 to 90% of all victims of ongoing abusive behavior are female. And that's what we're really most concerned about. So there are some men, basically about 1 out of every 6 to 1 out of every 10 victims of domestic violence will identify as male. And then likewise, the same in terms of women perpetrating. And then we also know that domestic violence is at roughly the same rates in LGBTQ relationships as well. Domestic violence, one mention I want to make, this is a slide that I don't think you all, I've shared with you all before, but I think you all would be especially appreciative of this, is it's very important that when you're looking at domestic violence statistics, you differentiate between crime statistics and actually prevalence rates. Because if we look at, in the United States, if we look at crime statistics, in other words, those who are arrested and convicted of domestic violence, we see that working class men and men of color are overrepresented. They are disproportionately. And so that's easy to think then, if you look at those stats, to think that domestic violence is much more of a problem among working class folks. Likewise, if you talk to a lot of survivor services, they tend to be working a lot with working class women who need housing, who need things of that nature. And from all that, it's easy to think it's more of a working class issue. One kind of example of that is tank top t-shirts, which used to be kind of affiliated with the working class, were called wife beaters, for example. And that's not really the case. When we look at more general prevalence rates, we find that domestic violence is also quite prevalent in middle class and upper class homes. But why is it that among the domestic violence arrests, there's an overrepresentation? And there are a number of explanations for that. One is that wealthier men have other ways of instilling their power in their families besides getting physical. Another is a practical issue that if you're working class, you're more likely to live in an apartment building, and if you live in a house, it's going to be on a smaller lot. In each case, they're going to be less well made, probably, which means that sound's going to carry more easily. And so it's easier to make reports. Whereas if you're middle and upper class, larger homes, in a home, larger lot, less likely to be witnessed by others who might call the police. In middle and upper class folks, they're less likely in general culturally to call the police on their neighbors. The police are also less likely to intervene with wealthier folks. We know that our criminal justice system is racist. I think it's pretty obvious. And that is also linked with classism, which is why you see that working class overrepresentation. Wealthier men are better able to afford attorneys to avoid getting prosecuted, even if they do get arrested. Likewise, the abused partners, if they're wealthier, have more avenues for getting themselves safe so that they don't necessarily have to call 911. And then a big one that's important to understand is that typically a criminal charge is going to have a much larger negative impact on somebody who's wealthy than on somebody who's poor. I'm not saying that it doesn't have an impact on poor folk as well, but the analogy I use is, most of us probably occasionally speed. I know that I do. And there's always a question, if you speed, there's a risk of getting a speeding ticket. And I've got a couple in my driving career. And, they run a couple hundred, 250, $300, something like that. What if suddenly a speeding ticket were $10,000, right? I know for myself, if suddenly a speeding ticket was $10,000, I wouldn't be speeding ever. And so think about an abusive man who works a minimum wage job that he's had for 6 months and could care less about. And he gets arrested for DV and he loses his job. What's the impact on him? Well, there's still the impact of losing his job and having that arrest. But, there are other jobs to be had. It wasn't like he had a career or anything like that. On the other hand, if you have, let's say, a doctor that gets arrested for domestic violence, that could cost them 6 figures ultimately in loss of income and potentially losing their career, which could be much more than that. So there's even more incentive for wealthier folks to make sure they're not breaking the law. That doesn't mean they aren't being abusive, just that they're not going to do illegal abuse. So these are some of the reasons for these overrepresentations. So here's one slide on the international rates of domestic violence. What we find is, like I said, on average, around the world, about 1 in 3 women will experience at least one physical assault, sometimes in her lifetime, but it varies a great deal. Now, these stats are going to be lower because they're only looking for the past year. So the question was, in these different countries, just for the past year, and this is pre-COVID, were the women physically or sexually abused? And the general international average is just under 20%. But you can see pretty wide ranges of frequencies of assault around the world. And then here's a visual graphic. The darker the green, the more unsafe women are. The lighter the green, the safer they are. So there's that. So here's where things get more grim. And if you've been following the news at all, what you know is the COVID-19 pandemic has led to a significant increase in domestic violence. Now, when this was first getting going, and to me, in our country, I was immediately concerned as an expert that there would be increases in domestic violence for reasons I'll give near the end of the presentation. However, I was not expecting to see these levels of increase. So this has been a little stunning to me, even as an expert. So this comes from the Oregonian. They surveyed local counties just recently for their rates of domestic violence in April. Multnomah County reported a 40% increase in felony domestic violence cases. Clackamas County reported a 47% increase. In Clark County, which is where Vancouver is, just across the border, they saw a 40% increase in harassment calls. This is very typical, these levels of increases. And so I've got a few more. There have been it says recorded, it should be record jumps in DV around the world. France, for example, again, you can see some of these slides are a little bit, could use another round of proofreading, but France reported a nationwide spike of 30%. Multiple European countries reported that about 10 days after their lockdown started, whatever that was, domestic violence calls jumped. Southwest England, one area reported an increase of 20%. In Russia, which has its own dubious connection with domestic violence, DV complaints doubled in March. And likewise in China, in some parts of that country, domestic violence rates tripled during the lockdown. A few more DV helplines. It's been an interesting kind of mix. Some DV hotlines are seeing significant increases. Others are seeing things really dropping down. But for example, in Spain, there was an 18% increase in calls. Beijing reported a surge in calls once the local province went on lockdown. In Chicago, likewise, saw an increase in calls. What's been also very consistent is not only is there more DV, there's more serious domestic violence. So I've heard this repeatedly. I've heard this from colleagues. I've read this in the newspaper. Other countries are reporting this. Other experts are reporting this. Not only there's more DV, there's more serious domestic violence. What's also important to understand, and again, I'm going to be zipping through the DV 101 stuff, but the mindset that drives abusive behavior towards a romantic partner, I would suggest to you, is the mindset that drives a lot of violence in general. And we're seeing indications that it's not just domestic violence that's going up. The people who have this kind of mindset are doing more violence. And so a couple of other examples of this are significant increases in cyber stalking. One obvious group of targeted with cyber stalking are romantic partners, but they aren't the only group. And so one example, you see the bottom point, influencers, right? And influencers are people who are basically, they have their Instagram account or their Twitter feed or things of that nature, and they're promoting products. And they get paid to promote products that they use and things of that nature. And so, especially among younger folk, they become quite popular. They've reported significantly increased harassment since COVID-19. And there was a recent story about them. And even some of the protesters we're seeing, the armed protesters, I would suggest to you again that a lot of their mindset is very much in line with the mindset of an abusive partner, regardless of whether they're an abusive partner or not. So we're seeing this being aggravated in lots of different areas. Now, we do see some trends of DV appearing to go down, such as the filing of restraining orders or sometimes the calls to helplines. But what that's actually a strong suspicion is that it's not an actual reduction in abusive behavior. It's that the people who are being abused are not able to access those resources or aren't as safe to be able to access those resources, which is why we're seeing a drop. I was just reading one stat that indicated that one women's crisis line, not locally, I can't remember where, in 1 month had the highest number of calls they'd ever had and the lowest number of calls they'd ever had in the same month, which kind of captures that, I think well. Now, another thing we're seeing is that crime in general has been dropping due to social isolation. One report that I looked at, for example, in Chicago, crime had declined by 42%, in Austin, Texas by 18%. And we saw there was a trend downward in domestic violence arrests as well. They aren't dropping at the same rate. So for example, in that same time period, domestic violence arrests declined by 23%, and in Austin by 13%. And so what we're seeing is even if there is some some decline in DV, it's not dropping nearly as much. And so what I've been hearing anecdotally, don't think I've read this in any of the articles that I reviewed, but I've heard this from colleagues, is that some areas are reporting, as of now, the majority of calls to 911 are DV related. So while calls in general are down, what's happened is because DV's not dropped as much, it's occupying more of the space. So that's a little bit about domestic violence in the age of COVID-19. What I would just say to offer some speculation is what some people are expecting, and of course we don't know. None of us have ever been through this before, and certainly not in terms of identifying domestic violence as a social issue. Really, domestic violence has only been identified as a social issue since the 70s or late 60s. But what a lot of folks are expecting is as the country starts to open up, there's going to be a surge in DV charges. There's going to be a surge in need for services for some of the reasons later on that I give on why DV's up during COVID. As there's a little bit more freedom, we'll actually see a bounce that way. Now, how much that actually happens remains to be seen, but there's some speculation on that. Based on the fact that COVID-19 and some of the adjustments are likely to be with us for a while, there may well be a second or even a third wave of shutdowns, that this may also lead to additional jumps in domestic violence. There also may be some accumulation over time of distress and other issues that may also contribute to it. So this may well become the new normal for a while. So very quickly, and some of this will be review for those of you who have heard me present before, I want to kind of do a bit of a DV 101 so that when you're reading the newspaper or hearing reports about domestic violence, you better understand what we mean. So domestic violence involves, and this is a definition that comes from the Oregon Council of Domestic Violence from about 25 years ago, a very typical definition, a pattern of coercive behavior used by one person to control and subordinate another in an intimate relationship. I think it's a nice, elegant, clean definition and pretty typical way that domestic violence is defined. So when we talk about coercive behavior, physical abuse is the one that most people think of, hitting somebody, beating them up, restraining them, things of that nature. But there are a number of other forms of domestic violence. Verbal abuse includes calling a person names, putting them down, tearing them apart with words, yelling at them, things of that nature. Psychological or emotional abuse involves nonverbal things that can make a person feel afraid or intimidated. Things like intense looks, intimidating facial expressions, gestures like flipping somebody off or shaking your fist at them. Financial abuse includes things like controlling the money or micromanaging the money, or making secret purchases, or imposing unilaterally your financial values. Sexual abuse within this context is sexual abuse typically of a sexual partner, and includes things like pressuring them to be sexual when they don't want to be, manipulating them, putting them down sexually, badgering them for sex, things of that nature. And the one that may be less familiar to you and is typically not talked about in this way, this is a term that I coined, is collateral abuse, which refers to people that are exposed to the abusive behavior that aren't the intended target, but are negatively affected by witnessing it. And the most obvious group are children that are in abusive homes who may overhear it or see the aftermath of it. And we know that children that are exposed to domestic violence can be as negatively impacted by that as children who are directly physically abused, and that sort of thing. So these are all forms of abusive behavior. And what I will mention, I'm seeing here, is that the vast majority of domestic violence, even in the most physically violent relationship, is primarily non-physical abuse. It's primarily these other forms of abuse. And there are some domestically violent relationships that have no physical abuse at all. And some of those folks are people that are in the groups that I run who are coming in voluntarily. And what's important to understand is that most of our laws, both in Oregon and around the country, and even around the world, are against physical violence. And there are relatively few laws that capture these other forms of abusive behavior. And the few that have been passed in countries like England, they've been really struggling to enforce them or make them very effective. And so there are really three waves, in my opinion. There are kind of three ways internationally of responding to domestic violence. The first is through grassroots activism. And that's where most of the world is. The United States went through that phase back in the 70s and 80s, was grassroots activism. That's phase one. That's to this day in 2020, that's where most of the world is still, even in Europe, for example. Phase two is criminalizing of domestic violence. And that's what happened in the United States in the 80s and especially in the 90s. In the mid 90s is really where the United States, with the passage of the Violence Against Women Act, with the consciousness raising that happened with O.J. Simpson, that's where the United States really moved forward with that, for example. And there are only about 10 or so countries in the world that have really done this and done this well. United States, Canada, Australia, UK, New Zealand, and that's when we start to trail off, really. So maybe more like half a dozen countries. And then the third wave, which is really where the United States is on the cusp of doing, is really around more community action. And I'll talk about this near the end of my presentation, which is really going beyond just criminalizing it to actually, as a community, becoming informed and taking a stance. And that's really what we're on the cusp of, and we need to be moving into more strongly. Now, a great illustration, a parallel illustration of this, to help you better understand what that looks like, is around substance abuse. I would say in the past 20 to 30 years, the United States has shifted from a phase two, criminalizing of substance abuse, to community action around substance abuse now. And what that looks like now is that lots of different folks are intervening around substance abuse issues. Employers are taking stances. Clergy are kind of intervening around that issue. We've got healthcare professionals that are intervening around this issue. And so back in the day, my early training back in the late 80s, when I first came to Portland, was in substance abuse work. And the groups that I was helping run and the programming I was involved in involved almost exclusively court-involved people, people that got DUIs or got possession charges. There were relatively few people who were being mandated by employers or family members so much. And that's really changed in those years since then. And, you know, as a people, we understand addiction relatively well. You can ask 7-year-olds what addiction is, and they give you a decent definition of that. That's where we need to be with domestic violence, and that's where we need to get to with domestic violence. So, domestic violence is about power and control. It's not just about being abusive, it's about controlling somebody. To be controlling of somebody is to make that person act or think or feel in a certain way without them freely choosing to do so. So you're interfering with a person's freedom and liberty to make their own choices. So, you know, influence is getting somebody to do what you want because they choose to do it. So influence is fine. Persuasion, same idea, that's fine. Those are all good things to do. Controlling is when you either coerce somebody through like being abusive towards them or badgering them or giving them a third degree, or manipulate them through like deception or lying or withholding information or otherwise misleading to do what you want to do without them freely choosing to do so. So that's kind of that. And then again, I think previously I talked in more detail a year and a half ago about controlling behavior and what have you. But again, in the interest of time, I'm going to kind of move through this quickly. And then what's really important is we're not talking about single isolated acts of abusive behavior. Okay. And again, this is not an addiction. So even though I'm going to be evoking some addiction parallels, I'm not trying to convey that people are addicted to anger or addicted to violence. I don't think that's the case. But again, you can better understand this. While everybody who is an alcoholic has gotten drunk before, not everybody who gets drunk is an alcoholic, right? You know, any of us can have a moment or two of getting drunk or doing something stupid when we're drunk, like getting a DUI. And for those of us who are not alcoholics, it's very easy to correct that behavior. You know, we correct it and it's done. The people that have an addiction issue have an issue over and over and over again. It's the same thing with domestic violence. What we're concerned about is not individual acts of abuse. It's an ongoing pattern of abuse, okay? And again, the analogy that I use is the difference between, if you can think about acts of abuse as being raindrops, you know, if they're just, in this moment, I was, sarcastic with somebody, which would be verbal abuse. In this situation, I just rolled my eyes at somebody like they were acting like an idiot. That's psychological abuse, and so forth. Drop a rain here, drop a rain there, drop a rain there. That's less the concern than somebody's being controlled here, which is like being in a rainstorm. So being in an abusive relationship is kind of like being in a rainstorm. Lots and lots of different controlling and abusive behaviors that happen. So what drives this frequency is a belief system, a pro-abuse belief system. And this is kind of what's vital in our addressing this. And in other words, what's happening is the difference between people who are abusive and people who are not is that people who are abusive give themselves permission to be abusive, whereas people who are not abusive won't. It doesn't mean that we may not joke or maybe even think in passing about being abusive, but we don't give ourselves permission to do that. People who are abusive do give themselves permission, and it's really driven by a larger worldview. And so a key part of helping folks who are abusive stop that is not just helping them stop their behaviors, but change their beliefs. Okay, and so you can think about that as the beliefs are like the roots. So abusive dandelion. So you see a dandelion, you don't want that dandelion in your lawn, so you chop off the dandelion so you can't see the flowers anymore. You pull out the flowers, they're gone. You think, okay, it's gone, I've taken care of it, right? That's like stopping discrete behaviors. However, of course, if you don't uproot the plant, boop, more dandelions will appear. If you really want to remove the plant, same thing with blackberries, right? Same idea, you gotta uproot it. And the roots are the belief system. So, and we've seen this in this country where because of our laws against domestic violence, the rates of physical abuse have dropped dramatically. Pre-COVID, this was true. They had dropped dramatically, especially in the 90s when we passed a lot of these laws and got more aggressive. Part of what was happening is we were taking the tops off dandelions. And so there were a growing number of abusive partners in the United States that stopped their physical abuse or stopped most of their physical abuse while continuing or even escalating their non-physical abuse. In other words, they stopped the abuse that could get them arrested while continuing or escalating the abuse that could not get them arrested. And a dark example of this is that we can see is in Russia, where it's been about 5-ish years now. Russia, contrary to pretty much the rest of the world, decided to actually legalize some domestic violence. They basically softened their stance. They said, you know what? A little bit of physical abuse to your partner or your child, that's okay. Not that big a deal. We're not going to prosecute it. Guess what happened when they actually decriminalized child abuse and domestic violence, right? What a surprise. It went up. So that's what they did in Russia. And again, I think that what happened is they didn't create new abusive partners. It's just that the abusive partners that previously had been more careful about being physically abusive because they might get arrested, once they didn't have to worry about getting arrested, they started doing more of it. Imagine that. All right. So again, the analogy that I've shared before is the domestic violence house. The chimney of the house is the physical abuse and the ugly verbal abuse. It's obvious, it stands out, you can see it from far away. That is not what the abuse primarily involves. This house is made out of lumber or stone or drywall. That's the emotional abuse, the controlling behaviors, and the foundation upon which it's built are the beliefs. And if you don't change the beliefs, but you just change the behaviors, it's like building a new house on a bad foundation. It's not going to be as well supported. So here again captures well from Stephen Covey the idea of the thinking here. We see the world not as it is, but as we are, or as we are conditioned to see it. When we open our mouths to describe what we see, we in effect describe ourselves, our perceptions, our paradigms. Okay? So a few other quick points that I want to make about domestic violence. These are also going to be new slides to all of you because I didn't share this before. Is an important dynamic is the power differential between the abusive partner and the abused partner. And to some extent, excuse me, in most abusive relationships, the abused partner is hostage to the abuse. In other words, they aren't, for some reason or more than one reason, they aren't able to fully escape from it. They aren't able to get away from it. And this power differential is very important because, and that can include physical difference in power. One person can be physically stronger than the other. This can be a financial power difference, an intellectual power difference, as well as other forms of leverage. And I mean, the most obvious example of this, one of the most obvious examples, is how often, we certainly know that adults sexually abuse children. How often do you hear about children sexually abusing adults? We certainly have heard about teachers sexually harassing and abusing students. How often do you hear about students sexually abusing teachers? Or we hear about supervisors sexually harassing employees, but not employees sexually harassing supervisors. And part of what this is about is that power differential, right? So let's say that I like to sexually harass women, right? If I'm a middle manager, I'm not going to sexually harass the big boss who's a woman, because if I sexually harass the big boss, I can lose my job. I have no problem sexually harassing the women who are beneath me, so to speak, who I'm supervising because I have power over them. Unless, of course, there are things put in place to keep my power in check. So the idea here is that the power that you have, you can use to overpower others. You can also use it to protect yourself from others being abusive towards you, right? So part of us stopping abusive behavior across the board in general, not just during COVID-19, is to empower victims. I don't just mean in the moment. I mean that as we create greater equality, there's less opportunities to exploit power differences to become abusive in any realm. On the other hand, as the gaps increase, there's greater temptation and ease for those who have the power to use the power inappropriately to abuse others. So another important point is about the whole idea of leaving and escaping and getting safe from domestic violence. A very common thing that's said about abused partners is, why doesn't she leave, right? Why don't you leave? God, he sounds awful. You should leave him, okay? And it's important to not get drawn into that too much, okay? Because for one, it's an easy thing to say, and it is so much more difficult to do. For another, and again, I've heard over the years from hundreds and hundreds of abused partners, and almost always the problem isn't the relationship, the problem is the abusive and controlling behavior. So what they want is, they don't want to end the relationship, they want the abusive and controlling behavior to stop. Now, if the only way for them to get safety from the abusive and controlling behavior is to end the relationship, some will ultimately choose to do that. Some won't, but some will. But that's not their first choice typically, with many good reasons. So why do people who are abused stay? And I'm going to scroll through the slides quickly. I've got a handout, which I'm happy to share with you all via email or something of that nature. We can work out the logistics later, of 50 reasons why abused partners stay. So if you're familiar with the Paul Simon song, 50 Ways to Leave Your Lover, this is 50 reasons why abused partners stay. And again, I don't have time to go through these in any detail, so forgive the way I move through these, but they include fear of retaliation if they leave. We know that abused partners are at their greatest risk as they are leaving or after they've left. There are logistical barriers to leaving, such as the economics. They may question their own ability to live independently, especially if they've been in a long-term relationship. There may be a variety of negative consequences to them that they leave. When they leave, they may have concerns about their children. They may be socially isolated. There may be pressure from their loved ones to stay. They may continue to hope that things will get better. And of course, the abusive partner is not just an abusive person. They have other qualities that may be very desirable or positive. So there are lots and lots of reasons, legitimate reasons, why abused people stay. All right, so and another quick point I want to make before I kind of zero in more tightly into COVID, and this is all in part laying the foundation for some final remarks I'll make about COVID, is that it's easy to think of domestic violence as an individual issue, that individual abusive partners are abusing individual partners, but it's really also a much larger macro issue. There are larger social and cultural values and institutions that play a role. Examples include values like the man is the head of the household, or words don't hurt. There's a role that oppression plays. That typically what we find is that oppression is often exploited in terms of using that to dominate and control. And then our social structures in terms of whether we have laws against domestic violence, or there are folks like the law enforcement are well trained about domestic violence. And, you've all heard the phrase, it takes a village to raise a child, right? This idea that it isn't just a family, it's part of a village. And the rejoinder to that, if it takes a village to raise a child, it takes a village to abuse one as well. And this comes from the movie Spotlight. And really the idea is that we can unwittingly collude and support abusive behavior, or we can take a stand against it as a community. So kind of, this is a power and control wheel out of Duluth, the Duluth program, and it lists different pie slices of different forms of abusive behavior. And this is what individuals will do. But the point here is there are institutions and our cultural values can challenge these behaviors, which is why it's not enough to just focus on individuals. We have to look at the ways we respond as a society and our larger cultural values. And again, in the United States, we made some pretty substantial changes, especially back in the 90s, and we saw corresponding drops to some extent in domestic violence. So this does make a difference. We just have to keep plugging along with this. So the idea of a coordinated community response or coordinated action model, well, yes, you have the criminal justice system as one kind of slice of the response to domestic violence, but we all need to go and be involved, whether we're healthcare providers, whether we do social services, whether we are employing people, how do we support and monitor employees who are either being abusive or being abused, as teachers, as part of our religious communities and so forth and so on. And the idea is the more tightly we coordinate with each other around issues of domestic violence, the tighter a web we have to capture and catch those who are being abused and are being abusive. Okay, so now with all that as kind of the background, I want to talk a little bit more about domestic violence right now, especially in the past few months during COVID-19. So why is it that we're seeing such a jump around the world in domestic violence? And here are quickly some reasons that I've come up with and that colleagues as well has come up with that I would also agree with. One is you're having a lot more interaction with abusive partners. The more contact there is, the more opportunities there are to be abusive. And so whereas before there may have been separation due to employment, there may have been separation due to volunteer activity, due to kids having activities, so forth and so on. People are much more cohabitating together, and so there's and having a shelter in place, and so there's a lot more opportunities to be abusive. We know there's been significant increases in alcohol and drug use, which aggravate domestic violence. Actually, one point I want to make as I go through this list is none of these things cause domestic violence. Okay, they trigger domestic violence. In other words, somebody who's generally not abusive is not going to suddenly become abusive during COVID-19. Yes, somebody who's not been abusive in the past may have a moment of being imperfect, a moment of screwing up. But again, what we're concerned about are these ongoing patterns, which is what really drives it. So again, what causes domestic violence is a pro-abuse belief system, as well as other circumstances that allow a person with a pro-abuse belief system to act abusively. Those are what cause domestic violence. None of these things on these slides cause it, but these are all things that can trigger it, okay? That's why I think it's an important distinction here. So we know alcohol and drug use don't cause domestic violence, but they can definitely trigger and escalate it. Loss of work, again, this is information we've had for years because we've seen this during other economic downturns is when the economy goes poorly, when there's a loss of work, domestic violence jumps significantly, both related to the direct loss of work, the loss of employment, as well as the financial impact of that. So financial stress can trigger domestic violence. Some people during COVID-19 are actually working longer hours. That additional stress of overworking can lead to more abusive behavior. And just in general, again, you take somebody who's prone to abuse and you stress them out, they're going to get more abusive, or they're more likely to be abusive. And there's lots of different things that are very stressful about COVID-19 beyond what I've already listed here. Other things are that typically people who are being abused have lots of savvy and canny ways of limiting the abuse that's done to them, of helping them stay safer or their children to stay safer. And they aren't able to get away the same way because they're being sheltered in home. Some of the places they could go, they can't go to anymore, or other ways they can kind of manage it, they've lost. There are limited resources for them to get safe in terms of shelter spaces and things of that nature. A lot of physical shelters are closing down due to contagion concerns. Even if the shelter is open, abused partners may not be wanting to go to shelter right now, concerns about contagion. Or, of course, before there were shelters, there were friends or friends of friends that would shelter you. That was really where things got started. Again, people may be less willing to do that or less wanting to seek that because of concerns about contagion. COVID-19 can certainly increase further the power differential. The abused partner may have lost their job while the abusive partner is still working, so they have even more economic power than they did before, for example. And then social isolation. And we know that typically abusive partners seek to isolate the abused partner often, and abusive partners themselves can be pretty socially isolated. So these are all things that I would say all have contributed to these significant increases we've seen in domestic violence during COVID-19. And also these same things are going to lead to continued higher levels of domestic violence. Another one that I didn't put up here that we haven't experienced so much right away, but we're going to see more of is a loss of funding. This is leading to COVID-19 is leading to huge international economic hardship that will likely take us years to recover from. And so that means we're going to have less money. And because most of the DV services rely on additional money and funding, they're likely to feel a pinch, further pinch, and have to further reduce their services. A lot of the add-ons are not considered essential. So for example, child welfare in the Portland metro area, they have DV point people. You know, they may be less willing to support DV point people when they have to be laying folks off and what have you to further trim their budgets. So there's more bad to come. So my last slide, and again, I wish I had brilliant, insightful, easy, things you never thought of about what can you do to address this. And unfortunately, I don't. So the most obvious one, which of course I see with almost every presentation on anything, what can you do? Give money, right? So part of that is to be willing to support financially agencies locally and nationally that are working to stop domestic violence. And that could include my agency. And on the next slide, the last slide, there's an indication of donations. You can actually go to the website and there is a place you can make a donation. So that's one, is giving money. Although I know these days lots and lots of folks are asking for money. But that's one thing. Another thing to do is politically to be willing to kind of let your representatives, both statewide and nationally, know that, hey, I'm assuming you're aware that DV rates are up. I think it's really important that you continue to prioritize, or that you prioritize support and funding for actions to reduce DV, whether it's passing laws or supporting law enforcement with specialized DV units or what have you, or of course, prioritize not cutting funds for survivor services, things of that nature. On a more personal level, is you can raise consciousness around domestic violence. Again, people typically have a very narrow understanding of domestic violence. So the reality is most people who are being abused, so most people who are being battered do not identify themselves as a battered or an abused person, okay? I didn't do my usual disclaimer at the beginning of this presentation, which is, I'm sure among you all, there may be some survivors of domestic violence. There's even a possibility hearing this presentation that you may start to realize, no, wait a minute, that's kind of my relationship, or that's kind of my sister's relationship, or my daughter's relationship, or what have you. So part of what we can do is raise awareness around domestic violence. Just like, back in the 70s, our thinking of alcoholism was the drunk on Skid Row. Nowadays, we understand they're functional alcoholics. There are variations of that people can actually look pretty together and still have a drinking problem. Even kids know that. Likewise, we need to go and raise awareness around what domestic violence really looks like, and helping people become more well-informed and enlightened about what it looks like, including the fact that it may be closer to them than they've ever thought. And this is a common experience when we bring students into the agency every fall. We train them, and inevitably, usually a couple start to realize, oh man, this actually has some relevance for me personally. This is my sister. This was my best friend. And I never thought of that as an abusive relationship, but the more you're describing this, I'm realizing that it was, or is. You can also do what you can if you do have personal connections to encourage both the person being abused as well as the person who's being abusive to get help and support. Again, locally, in my biased opinion, I think especially for those people who are coming in voluntarily, Allies in Change, I'm proud to report that we work with more voluntary abusive partners than any other agency in the country. Nearly 100 of the people we see are coming in voluntarily. And that's the future, I think, of doing this work. And so I think that we especially work as well as anybody can, probably better than most, honestly, with people coming in voluntarily, including making our fees not a barrier for that if people don't have much money. And then continuing to make sure that DV is staying on people's radar, that they're continuing to consider it as an issue, and that sort of thing. So with that, and look at that, I'm right on the money, just like I planned. Amazing. I'm happy at this point. I'll click over to the next slide for a minute so you all can see it. And that's contact information. You're welcome to get a hold of me beyond today, via email. And like I said, there's also our website, and then the place where you can make donations if you'd like to. But right at this point, I'm happy to take questions. And there's one that was sent just to me that I'll answer first. But if other people want to kind of chat, and then in just a minute, I'll stop sharing it so everybody can see each other. But the one that was chatted to me, and I think what you'll probably need to do is stay muted until you want to ask a question or what have you. And if you aren't familiar with Zoom, at the bottom if you click on participants at the bottom, you can also digitally raise your hand. But the one question I was asked is there evidence linking religion to domestic violence? And that's a good question. The answer is a complicated one. What we know is no religion or spiritual practice is above creating abusive partners. And so one example would be Buddhism, right? I think a lot of people, when they think about being Buddhist or practicing Buddhism, that it's so much about nonviolence and being respectful. And I will let you know, we do have and have had Buddhists in our abuse intervention groups. So what you do see is it gets more complicated is a lot of times within any particular religious practice, you have a range of values. So for example, Catholicism is not just one way of thinking, but in general, the religious practices that tend to support more traditional gender roles and especially tend to be more misogynistic in their ways of thinking are probably going to be at greater risk of producing violence or supporting domestic violence. So I'm not saying that the rates of domestic violence are the exact same across religious practices, but in general, there's not a strong connection. And it's more about, as you'd imagine, abusive partners tend to be more drawn to the subsets of religious practices that tend to be more dogmatic and more strident. Some are. But again, some abusive partners are in general very enlightened. They are quite well-informed and respectful of women in general. They can be very, very kind and sweet. In fact, the only woman that they're demeaning to, if they're heterosexual, is their female partner. So with that, I'll kick it open for questions or comments or things of that nature.
Thank you, Chris, for a very informative presentation and for the great work that you're doing at Allies in Change.
Thank you. You're very welcome.
I'll take a look at the chat, but I do have a first question. I have a couple of female friends in my life that I was concerned about their relationship before the pandemic. I'm even more concerned now, and I just want to know, in terms of relocation, how is it working in society? I mean, it seems so difficult to even look for apartments right now because people don't want to be around other people. So what are the best strategies for people looking to relocate?
Well, it's complicated, much more complicated. So what a lot of the local survivor services are doing is they're actually closing their shelters and giving out hotel vouchers or motel vouchers. And to some extent, of course, the utilization of motels these days is way down. And so I suspect, I don't know this for a fact, but I strongly suspect part of what's happening is that some of these motel owners are generously, to their credit, freeing up motel rooms for survivor services. So part of it may be donations. Part of it is that they've got some additional money, some survivor services do, to pay for motels. But a lot of survivor service agencies are not providing services in person right now or are doing it in a very limited way. And so part of the challenges are some of the ways people can get support to these kinds of relocation. They aren't able to in the same way. As you mentioned, people are still renting places and buying houses. It hasn't stopped altogether, but it's been really affected. So I don't think it's so much that one specific thing. It's more all these other things that you need to do. I mean, as any of us who have moved, it isn't just literally the moving process or not even finding someplace else to live. It's the packing, it's the financial shifting, it's the making the, transferring utilities, and all this stuff can be very challenging in terms of COVID-19 right now. So I think most of all, what you can do is ask somebody, how can I help? What is, if there's anything that you need me to do, or you can also offer ideas. But I think there's not any one trick to this. It's just, and of course, part of what some abuse partners are doing is they're slowing down their timelines. They're aware that now is not a good time to relocate for lots of reasons, and so they're shifting their timelines and doing what they can to stay in place with the abusive partner for a variety of reasons.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, there's a question in the chat from Joyce.
Yeah, so Joyce was asking, isn't it about empowerment of women throughout the world? And if COVID sets that back, will this work be set back? Yeah, sadly, yes. We know who the people who are disenfranchised get more disenfranchised, right? I mean, this is inevitably what happens. And this has been a major hit for everyone. And hopefully, we'll see what happens. We can be hopeful about this, but in general, there are going to be other priorities. And what was it in Russia? So here's a great example of this. In Russia, feminists in Russia have been pushing strong to repeal this softening of DV laws. And they were getting a lot of energy behind it. But then the government was much more focused on passing laws to get Putin to stay in power longer. So, so that took a back seat. Okay, and that has nothing directly to do with COVID, but I think that's what you're going to be seeing, is because the press is on how do we get businesses started, how do we go and deal with this contagion. That's going to take more energy and dollars, and again, other actions such as empowerment of women, I think, will take more of a back seat. The UN, among others, has been very outspoken about the way that women and girls are disproportionately victimized around the world based on their gender, and they continue to do those kinds of things. I just think that, people are going to be distracted from these things by the more immediate concerns, if you will, of COVID-19.
Yeah, you talked about the increase in, during the virus of domestic violence. Is that only toward the spouses, or is that also toward the kids?
Yeah, the studies, that's a great question. And this is what I can tell you, and this has its own chilling nature. In general, reports of child abuse have been dropping significantly. Okay. So that's what we know. Now, guess why people think that's true? Not because it's dropping down, right? But because, for one, kids aren't in school, and involvement in school is a common trigger of child abuse reports. Seeing therapists, and they aren't seeing therapists in person, right? Just if they're doing therapy work, it's just through teleconferencing for the most part, to some extent. So I think that speaking as an expert, I have a strong suspicion that child abuse rates have been increasing for many of the same reasons. Now, again, there's overlap between child abusers, people who abuse children, and people who abuse their partners, but they aren't 100% the same. So there are people that are directly abusive only to their partner. They're never directly abusive to a child. And there's some people that are abusive towards a child that are not directly abusive to their partner. So while there is significant overlap, it's not, anywhere near 100%. But I think, again, sadly, there's no reason to think that child abuse hasn't significantly increased for many of the same reasons that I listed around domestic violence as well.
Thank you.
Okay, there's a chat question from Michael.
So about intervention of children who are showing signs of becoming perpetrators themselves. Yeah, so that's only one of the things we want to do, is do more prevention. I think it's more about general education than it is about prevention. Because just because a 15-year-old slaps his girlfriend does not mean that he's going to be an abusive man when he's 25, right? Just because a 15-year-old's passing out drunk does not necessarily mean that they're going to be an alcoholic. Now, they might, become an abusive partner as an adult, but it's a lot harder to tell among teens or among youth who's going to be abusive or not. And I think we have to be careful about that, because we can, again, try to say, well, I'm not like those people, so there's no risk of me or my kids becoming that way. And for example, what we know is a significant number of abusive partners grew up in respectful homes. So while it's true that some of the most severe abusers grew up in abusive homes, when we get to some that are not as severe, that falls away. So I think that really the way we really need to intervene with kids around domestic violence is similar around substance abuse, which is to get them educated, to understand what domestic violence is, what a healthy relationship looks like, and what an unhealthy relationship looks like. It's helping them understand what emotional abuse looks like, what controlling behaviors looks like. That, I think, is really the most important part of prevention, is all kids should be educated in kind of like DV 101 at an age-appropriate level, and talked about what do healthy and unhealthy relationships look like. And the whole idea of consent. Consent is not just around sex, it's much more broadly around any kind of behavior. So yes, I think it's less about targeting, that kid, he's going to become a perpetrator, and more about all kids and teenagers, in general, understanding what abuse and control is, and how to take care of yourself and stay safe, and what you can do if someone is trying to show those behaviors and that sort of thing.
Hi. My question is, when a family member does make the move to get away and has found a safe place to be and has stopped the relationship with the abusive partner, but there's always the risk of them going back. What's the best way for the family to behave to support them and keep them away from that person?
Yeah, so one of the things I've learned, I work a lot with abusive partners, but by extension, I also work with the abused partners, and I also have worked with abused partners over the years. And one of the things I've learned from them is, in general, it's better to leave later rather than sooner. It's almost contrary to thinking, it's better to leave later rather than sooner. And the way I think about it is